Alright, so I did something I never thought I was gonna do with this game. I grinded against giant big balls for around an hour and a half. So, I just could not get past humanity. It had too much health, it did too much damage to me. So, for an hour and a half, I ended up grinding those purple orb challenges both in the second region and the third. I started doing the third region when I stopped getting perks from the second region ones. It seems the perks you end up picking up from the purple orb challenges are somewhat limited by region. You can't get all of them in the first or second region that way, I guess. You do end up having to do the third region challenges if you end up wanting all of your perks. And I ended up picking up the rank 3 variant, which requires picking up both the rank 1 and rank 2 variants of pretty much every perk. Not purposefully, but just because it took a while to get the rank 3 variants of the ones I wanted. Shield Piercer, so that way I can get through Esh easily enough. I really don't want to have to deal with the shield. That's just too much of a hassle. And then Assassin and Executioner for a crit focus build. With all of the major bonuses and these two perks, I end up having a 50% chance to crit. And even though my regular damage is greatly reduced, my crits do 900% damage. So that more than makes up for that loss. In fact, once I got the rank 2 variants of these perks on, I basically... what's the word? Dance? No, I just glided through the purple orb challenges with ease. Because, like, if I don't get crits, I don't do very much damage at all, but if I get just a few crits, the enemies get absolutely obliterated. The burst damage with this build is kind of insane. Keep an eye on the boss's health bar in this upcoming attempt and you'll see what I mean, assuming I'm not too unlucky. With a chance RNG focused build like a crit build, there is always the possibility that I just won't get crits at all, even if I do have a 50% chance to get them. But that would require especially poor luck. Also, while in the third region, I picked up this perk here. This was actually a hidden one. I kind of wish I had shown off collecting it. You can look up the location if you want. It's Steel Spine. There's a topic in the Steam discussion forum about it. It's hidden in the third region in an unmarked room. So you just kind of either have to discover it by chance or know where it is and glide down to it. And it's not bad. A pretty huge defense boost, and since that loading screen tip does say that the advantages always outweigh the disadvantages, I'm assuming that extra 40% damage reduction more than makes up for the pretty greatly reduced health and shields. I'm obviously not going to use it here though. That would ruin the setup I got going. And of course, while in the process of grinding up those rank 3 perks, I ended up getting pretty much every node in the tree. At least the ones I wanted. The only major ones I ended up passing up on were some extra ammo and energy focused ones because I didn't really need that stuff at that point. Oh, I also ended up picking up the very important one that lets my cannon land critical hits. Since my cannon damage is reduced by that one perk as well. Executioner, was it? Where was it? Nope, that's not it. There it is, yeah, because both melee and cannon damage get reduced by half. So having the cannon crit is important for it actually being useful. So yeah, that's what I did while off screen, and I've technically done the ending already, but I've decided to re-record this bit, just because I wasn't too big of a fan of how things went down. Not in terms of the gameplay, it only actually took me a few tries to take down the final boss with this build. More so on the commentary side. While doing the credits, I ended up giving my overall thoughts on the game, and I was way too rambling for my liking, so I'm just going over it again. I also kind of want to fight the final boss once more, just to see if I can do it as easily as I did that time. But yeah, look at the damage I just did through Esh's shield. That is the power of crits with this build. Of course, if I don't get a crit as I did there, or did not there, language, I do basically next to nothing. that does have the unfortunate side effect of making the charge up move in the Stinger, which previously was so useful, way less useful than just regular attack spams. Because I only have a 50% chance to actually get those powerful crits, I want to do more hits in a certain period of time than one strong hit, you know? But of course, as long as I get lucky, the Stinger is still super good. And it's still the best method of taking down Esh, just because it allows me to get off a whole bunch of damage if I'm lucky, while staying fairly evasive. The cannon is pretty nice as well, since if I time it right, I can end up hitting her twice, which gives me an extra chance to get those lucky crits. I'm not focusing on regular melee moves for Esh here because she still kind of outranks me in that regard. She just kind of ignores all my attacks. She doesn't really get hit stun by the regular ones. And she does enough damage even with my boosted stats that that's still fairly dangerous. So no matter what kind of build you go into this fight with, you do want to play things fairly safe. Which does contrast with the second phase where you kind of want to focus on dealing as many hits as possible to this giant floating Jack-off crystal. But you also want to focus mostly on evasion because even with a powerful build, this fight is going to take a while. There's no getting around that. I have about the greatest amount of damage you can possibly have, and it's still going to take me like several hundred hits to actually take it down. So in that regard, it ends up being a battle of attrition, and that's why you need to kind of focus on evasion more than anything. Because the attacks really aren't all that difficult to avoid, it's just a matter of keeping the presence of mind to actually do so. That way you don't end up losing out on your resources. Fortunately, if you do have all of your corrupted Eldritch abilities, and I really feel like this fight is designed with that assumption in mind, if you have all those abilities, it's not that bad. Probably the most useful one being the air dash, because that allows you to just spam it in the air, and avoid his charge, which is easily the most dangerous thing just because of the massive amount of damage it does. You also want to avoid getting hit by that Vine Orb, because it does a lot of damage if it makes direct contact. But yeah, when he starts doing this, basically just start floating in the air, don't do too many repeated dashes to lose all your energy, and just air dash when he charges past. I'm not doing the best job of it here. I'm definitely eating way too many hits. That's just a matter of me giving commentary though and thus being slightly distracted. Nothing I can do about that unless I just want to stop talking, and I don't. And I'm sure you don't either. You want to continue hearing this beautiful, beautiful voice of mine. But yeah, when he's doing the charges, focus mostly on evasion because you really don't want to get hit by those. In fact, I'm going to heal up even though I only have one shot left. That way if I get hit once more by the charge, I probably won't die. Yeah, your iframes on the air dodge last for such a long while. I wonder if those are upgraded by the teleportation upgrade, or if it's always that good and I just never noticed. Because as long as you do one, you're probably going to avoid his attack, but I like spamming it just to make sure. I have enough energy at this point that I don't have to worry about running out. Now I just nearly screwed myself there by doing that downwards attack. If I had been less lucky and hadn't landed on that platform, I would have ended up plunging right into the pit and probably wouldn't have been able to recover. It's not impossible to recover, but it's really difficult just because there really isn't any stable footing there. Unless you end up happening to land close enough to one of those grapple points to grapple onto it, it's basically a death. So basically never press down in this fight, otherwise you're gonna die. Now we are getting near the end here, thankfully. The fight, unlike all of the other big fights, doesn't really evolve that much as you go along. There is one final berserk phase near the end, but it only happens when he gets down to around like 20% HP. Much later than the other boss fights, and that's kind of disappointing. Because it's a fairly difficult fight at first, especially if you didn't grind as I did in my first few attempts. Grinding is really the main thing that's helped me here. But even though it is fairly difficult, once you know what to do, it's not that bad, and I mismanaged my energy there. If you do that, that's a pretty good ticket to death as well, just because then you won't be able to avoid his charge. My energy didn't come back quite quick enough. But once you understand the fight, it's really not all that bad. And at that point, it's just kind of a disappointment because the fight never really evolves until you get to that remaining 20% health. Which, I think at this point I'll just cut to. No need to watch all of that again. Alright, I think we've about reached the final phase. Not just yet, but it'll take just a few hits more. Hopefully I don't make mistakes using that last health shot because I'm so close. Yeah, during this last phase, he just ends up doing repeated rushes down and above. Doesn't last long though. He sounds so happy. But now it's time to kill the very last vestiges of our humanity. So yeah, this has been Sundered, embracing the corruption. I do have to say, that ending is exactly what I was hoping for when I decided to make the decision to embrace the Eldritch Truth, rather than resist it. Losing the last vestiges of humanity, becoming an avatar for Nyarlathotep, and unleashing hell upon the world. I couldn't have asked for more. So, while these incredibly long credits play, seriously, there's like 3 or 4 separate sections for Kickstarter backers. Let's discuss my overall thoughts on the game. First, I'm gonna cover the things I liked, and then I'm gonna cover the things I disliked. So, there is a lot to like about this game. The art is gorgeous, probably the best I've seen in a game, period. Better than Team Cherry's Hollow Knight. Better even than Vanillaware, who previously, for me at least, were the kings of hand-drawn 2D art in video games. And the fact that they managed to pass what is technically... well, Vanillaware aren't quite an indie team because they're a Japanese company. And the whole indie scene over there isn't quite the same as it is here in the West. Like, indie projects do tend to be smaller and super niche, and you end up having more sort of double A style stuff, smaller studios that end up working on passion projects that are funded by larger publishers. I think that has something to do with the whole corporate structure and corporate emphasis that Japan has. I'm not going to say anything more than that because I really don't know much at all, and I don't want to sound too much the fool. But yeah, they're technically a publisher-funded team with a lot of people, and yet I would say they, Vanillaware, have been beaten out by Thunder Lotus here. Like, not just because the art in this game is great, but it's so ridiculously fluid. Vanillaware's animation is pretty solid, especially in Odin Sphere. That's probably my favorite game of theirs. Although maybe Muramasa is a little bit better. I haven't played enough of that one to be sure, I've mostly only watched videos of it. But even at the best of times, their games aren't quite as fluid as this one was. And keep that in mind because there's probably a good reason why Vanillaware does that. It's a purposeful decision they make not to have the art be as fluid as possible. But in the case of pure positives, this game does have incredibly fluid animation and it just looks amazing. I like the whole theming of embracing versus resisting. It doesn't super go well with the whole Lovecraftian theming. In fact, the Lovecraft theming stuff feels mostly arbitrary. Like, if they had just reduced the number of tentacles in the game, and just changed some names and a few design choices around, they could have just made it about, like, Christian demons, and they wouldn't have had to change all that much. There isn't a lot of, Lovecraft's kind of nihilism, or racism for that matter, which is probably a good thing in that case. But yeah, the whole it being a Lovecraft-inspired game feels mostly arbitrary, and doesn't even come across in the designs for the most part. Like, I know the general pop culture idea of Lovecraft is tentacles, but that's only the tip of the iceberg in terms of the crazy design stuff. The crazy eldritch designs he came up with, so... But, yeah, I'm talking about the positives here. I'm going too much into the negatives too early. Wow, look at that credit there I just noticed. Fox Plays, subscribe to my YouTube. Using a video game you backed to advertise your YouTube channel. That's not only kind of greasy, but also kind of pointless. Like, I happen to notice it, but most people aren't even going to bother watching the credits. Maybe they didn't think the credits would be this long unless they'd have a chance of getting spotted, but... Come on, dude. But yeah, I do like the whole embrace versus resist theming and how it integrates with the gameplay. The fact that embracing things gives you way more crazy abilities, but overall boosts the difficulty of the game since you have those extra shade versions of enemies to deal with, as well as a more difficult final boss. I haven't seen the final boss of the resist path, but from what I've read, it's definitely a lot easier. So that stuff's cool. I love the sphere grid and the perk system. The sphere grid is nothing new. In fact, maybe it would be more accurate to call it more of a rogue-like style upgrade. Very similar to Rogue Legacy's trees in that regard, especially with the fact that you're typically going to upgrade after you die. That's very Rogue Legacy-like. But I like the fact that there are so many useful bonuses, and it's open enough, only being gated by the abilities you picked up, that you can choose what to go for first. So that even if ultimately you end up with all of the bonuses, and there's no differentiation between playthroughs in terms of what you end up with at the end, you can end up choosing what you get first and what you want to focus on early on at least. And there is still a lot of endgame build variety because of that wonderful perk system. They give you 3 perk slots, at least if you've picked up all of those upgrades, and they give you a wide variety of perks. Just in these last few videos alone, we saw my standby build, a cannon focus build, and then my ultimately successful critical focus build. That, by the way, if you ever play this game, seems to be the thing to focus on. That crit damage is kind of insane. It's especially good for dealing with crowds because while you can get unlucky and get no crits, and thus can't kill a thing, if you get just a few, you'll basically shred through even the toughest of enemies. With a little bit of luck, you'll have insane burst damage, and that goes a long way to keeping the hordes at bay. Kinda wish I had recorded some of my grinding because that was the only time in the game thus far that I've actually been able to finish off the enemies before more started spawning in. I was never able to do that with my previous builds, and that certainly was a change in experience. But yeah, the sphere grid and the perk system are wonderful. The best positive quality about the game, and one thing that has actually resulted in me starting a new playthrough on hard difficulty even, just to check out some of the resistance path options, is the character movement. This game is a dream to play. Even if the design isn't always the best, just moving Esh around the environment feels really, really good. She feels like a character out of a character action game, and I feel like she would be more suited to something like that, rather than this exploration-based Metroidvania sort of thing. But yeah, like, all of her animations, they feel super fluid and graceful. Like, this is the most graceful game I played this year, I think, outside of Nier Automata, which is a AAA game, so that's pretty impressive. Everything feels fluid, feels powerful. It's useful, at least if you can use it at the right times. Again, I didn't actually really show this off, but the charge moves, I actually got good at using them, and if you can do that, that helps with combat a lot. Simply because the charge moves, especially the corrupted ones, are not only very strong, but they end up knocking enemies away, so you can end up doing a sort of pseudo-juggle, which prevents them from attacking at all, and it really helps a lot. But yeah, just the sheer fluidity of the movement, you feel really powerful even when you end up being surrounded at all sides, and that's really good. So yeah, that's all the good stuff. Unfortunately, as good as the good stuff is, the bad stuff is equally as bad, if not worse. The level design, due to its procedural nature, is quite bland. And honestly, the whole procedural level design thing feels like something that maybe they decided on later in development when they were running out of funds or time, and wanted to create levels as quickly as possible to conserve on either of those. Because it doesn't feel like an idea they started with from the start. If it was, they didn't consider it as well as they should have. Because the important parts of the levels, the power-ups, the abilities, the perks, the mini-bosses, the bosses, those are all in fixed locations. So the only things that really change on any run are the paths to those specific situations. And that's not really all that profound of a difference. It did screw me over on occasion if I ended up taking a rather circuitous path due to how the smaller rooms were laid out, which let enough time pass that I ended up with a whole bunch of hordes on me when I actually got back to where I had died, and thus I couldn't make much progress. But outside of that, if I was just running to the same place, it wasn't really all that different from the previous run. That's why I did so much editing. And it just calls into question the whole choice of having procedural levels in the first place. It would have been better to just have fixed pathways that were handcrafted, because then they could have been designed with more challenges in mind. Similarly, I have pretty similar thoughts on the horde system. It would have been better if they had had fixed enemy encounters, rather than just randomly generated ones. So yeah, horde encounter system not great, bland level design. Enemies, there weren't enough varieties. They relied a little bit too much on palette swaps, and there wasn't too much difference between the various color palettes of the various enemy types, you know, the deer, the ticks, etc. Typically that just meant that the enemy had a slightly longer attack pattern and buff stats, but it didn't really change the way you dealt with them all that much. If the upgraded versions of enemies had more wholly new moves, they did in a few instances, but not many. If they had more new moves, that would have gone a long way to increasing the enemy variety, while not forcing them to generate a whole bunch more art assets. But as it is, they didn't do either of those things, so yeah, enemy variety not great, and the enemies themselves were a bit too simple. That's one of the reasons why I say that a character action game would have been better, given the overall feel of the movement, because in that kind of game, they could end up focusing on having a small core cast of enemies that would then be more complicated. I suppose they could have done that in the game as it is now, but that was a decision they chose not to make. I would have been fine with the amount and variety of enemies, had they just been a little bit more complex, is what I'm saying. It is what it is. So the art, as good as it is, I mentioned that perhaps there is a reason why Vanillaware games aren't as ridiculously fluid as this one, and I think that might be visual clarity. There's so much going on with all of the enemies, so many bright colors, so many moving parts, and just so many enemies in general thanks to that horde system that a lot of the time, as I voiced repeatedly throughout the playthrough, I just kept losing track of where Esh was on the screen, and thus ended up crashing into enemies, failing to avoid attacks, and failing to take down enemies as efficiently as I could. And that resulted in a lot of deaths. And that's an issue that they've improved on since Jotun. I've watched a little bit of a let's play of it, and actually telling where your character is during some of those big boss fights looks even more difficult than it is here. But even though they've improved since that game, they haven't improved enough. And I feel like one way they could do that is just toning down what the enemies can do. Because Jotun 2 was a game where the enemies had a lot of superfluous animation, and as gorgeous as that looks, it mostly just serves in the gameplay to distract the player. And thus, it ends up being more of a negative than a positive. Because as gorgeous as the art is, if it ends up interfering with the gameplay, that's kind of bad, since video games' whole thing is interaction. That's where the focus of the design should be. But it feels like they focused more on the art side, and that's where that whole issue comes from. Hollow Knight 2 is a game where the animations do tend to be pretty distinct and discrete, and there's not a lot of visual noise, and that results in that game having much clearer combat. Even during the more hectic enemy hordes like the Colosseum of Fools, I could still tell where my character was on the screen at pretty much all times, and that's because of the animation being more restrained. And probably though the worst thing about the game overall, at least after the art issue, is the overall balancing. Now, part of this was undoubtedly caused by the fact that I played on hard, but even if the enemies hadn't been as tough and I had been doing a little bit more damage to them, I still think it would have felt like I would have needed to have grinded. Like, I think I would have had a smoother path through the game had I simply taken the time after beating an area to just grind those purple orb challenges for a bit, both for more perk options, upgraded perks, and some extra shards for upgrades. I think that would have prevented a few of my deaths. And having grinding as part of your game design isn't the best. Like, at the end of the day, it's basically having poor enough design that forces the player to just artificially make themselves stronger to actually bull rush past through that poor design. So yeah, the balancing wasn't the best, that's for damn sure. I think actually a really good example of that was that one mini-boss in the 3rd region, the sniper, who, as you saw when I was fighting it during that first attempt, I really didn't have trouble with its pattern at all. It's just that it had so much health and I wasn't able to deal nearly enough damage that it just extended on for way too long. And that was pretty much the only reason I died. It just went on for so long that I inevitably ended up making enough mistakes to end up dying. Especially with the death pits surrounding everything. Can I just say, as much as I like the 3rd area, the introduction of that design element, those death pits on the sides and the ceiling and the floor, not great game design that, especially not in a Metroidvania, which is all about traveling around large areas and exploration. Typically, you don't expect to have an insta-death pit in that sort of game. But yeah, so overall, there's enough bad about this game that I can't really give it more, if I were to give it a numerical score, than a 6 out of 10, which isn't bad by any means. If I were an actual video games journalist, that would be bad, because they use a really lopsided scale. But in terms of an actual rating scale where 5 is average, 6 and above is good, and 4 and below is bad, I would give this a 6. There are issues, but not enough to detract from it enough that I wouldn't consider it an above-average experience. Perhaps not worth purchasing at full price, but if you could get this 30 or 50% off, and it looks like your kind of game, I would definitely recommend picking it up. Maybe play on normal instead of hard though, just to make your journey a little bit smoother. But it is definitely worth playing, just because one thing that you can't get from watching a playthrough of it is just how good the combat and the movement feels. Seriously, I keep raving about that just because it is singularly the best thing about this game, I think. I think I like that more than the art because that's actually part of the interactive portion of the game, and that's what you play games for, is the interactive stuff. So that ends up being more better to me. But yeah, so as many difficulties as I had with this game and as much bad design as it had, I don't regret playing this. It was definitely a worthy experience, and while I probably won't day one purchase or pre-order any of their future projects, I'll definitely be keeping an eye on Thunder Lotus, and seeing what the word is about whatever their next project is whenever they get around to releasing that. Probably not for a few years, of course. It takes time to develop games, and if the word ends up being positive enough, I'll probably pick it up. They're masters of art, they just need to integrate it with the gameplay a little bit more, and they will be one of the best indie developers on the market. Like, I would probably put them up there with Team Cherry at that point. Team Cherry being the developers of Hollow Knight, if I didn't mention that already. Wow, did I actually manage to pontificate until the end of the credits? Hey, nice. Yeah, I wasn't kidding about the credits being ridiculously long here. It's no mighty number 9, but it's still kind of insane. Resist or embrace, that is a good tagline, I will say. Canada Media Fund, and then Thunder Lotus's, what do you call that? Not mascot, sigil, symbol, logo, that's it. I couldn't think of the word for a second. It's nice and simple, very striking. Okay, I was just trying to fill the void there for a second while the credits end, because before I finish off this series for good, I mentioned I had started a second playthrough and was focusing on resisting rather than embracing. But technically speaking, on that playthrough, I haven't made that decision just yet. I played for 3 hours, and I made it far enough that I pretty much fully explored the first area, at least as much as you can without having picked up the power-ups from the other two. And I've beaten the big boss there. So that means I have 2 Elder Shards. So let's see exactly what happens when I bring them to that furnace there. Since, even though I am generally aware of what that does, having watched someone else play through the game with the resist path, generally when I'm watching videos, especially blind playthroughs, I tend to use them more as podcasts, more than anything. I'm sure that's true of most people listening to this. So I only end up half paying attention to things. And even if I was paying full attention, there's a vast gulf of difference between seeing something in a video game and actually experiencing it yourself. That's why outside of like visual novels, even if you feel you've gotten a full experience from watching a playthrough, if you liked what the game looked like well enough, I do always think you should end up picking it up at some point, if only on a steep sale, just to have experienced at least a little bit of the gameplay for yourself. Of course, that depends on the kind of funds that you have available to spend on video games. But if you can spend the money, it's definitely worth doing so. Alright, so I'm guessing he's gonna start raging at me if I start burning these, so let's enjoy. That was a pretty cool animation, I'll say. Hey, new Chivo. I don't think those recorded on the capture. It's called Science Prevails. And unlike most of the Chivos I've been picking up on my main playthrough, that one had an orange coloration as opposed to a purple eldritchy one. I like how he continues to try and persuade you from doing this as you continue to burn them. Getting quite angry now. So yeah, the main thing you get is a whole bunch of currency. Looks like I got more this time. 1,500 for the first, 2k for the second. So a pretty big boost to your leveling abilities. And the one other greater thing that it does that you probably won't notice at first. In fact, you probably won't notice until you die and start going back to your ability tree, which will hopefully show up sometime soon. Come on, returning to the sanctuary is supposed to not take out this long. Doesn't take that long to regenerate the world. There we go. For every Elder Shard you burn, you end up unlocking a smaller tree down here with unique abilities. such as your dodge rolling damaging enemies, or combo attacks dealing extra damage. So even if you don't have as crazy abilities as you do when you corrupt things, you still end up getting some unique stuff and power boost as well, and that's good. They may not be as great, but the fact that they do give you unique stuff is a really good design decision. It actually gives you a reason to try both paths. And even though I think I said before I probably wouldn't do a second playthrough, I'm actually sorely tempted to end up beating this game on the resist path just to see it. I mean, it probably wouldn't even take all that long, considering it only took me under 3 hours to beat the first area, when I think on my main playthrough it took me like 7. It's not too much of a commitment. Maybe I'll even end up recording the final boss of that playthrough as a bonus part. Well, we'll see. But yeah, assuming I don't do that, this has been Sundered. I've enjoyed it, and I hope you've enjoyed this playthrough as well. I'm not good at endings, so I'll just leave things here.